So hi everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't attend all the lectures from the school, so maybe there might be moments when I will repeat stuff that you've already heard. So the general what Ted asked me to do was something on decision making, and I talked a bit with Dragana, who's also going to do other lectures on decision making. And what I'm going to do during this lecture is mostly focused on extreme event attribution and how it's been designed as a tool to help decision making, and how there are flaws in the way it's been designed, and the general thoughts process where you have this scientific object, this type of results, and that's built by scientists to help decision making, and how maybe that's something that can apply more generally to climate services. Yep. Okay. Yep. So first of all, and if you have to remember just one thing from this lecture, just want you to be clear that we are not doing our science in a vacuum. And despite the way that most of the time natural and physical sciences are taught at university, there's a book by Colin Ridge and Reeve that was published in 1986. Its title is Science Speaks Truth to Power, and it's an examination of experts' practices. And this phrase, this sentence, science speaks truth to power, it's also what's been called in science studies linear model of expertise. And it's been shown many times that it's a chimera, it's not really the way that science and decision makers interact. And I think it's grounded a lot in the way we picture science as scientists and the way we teach it in universities with little interactions with social scientists. And also, there's this concept that I think is useful of epistemic and non-epistemic values behind the organization of science and the choice of some questions that researchers work on. That's from Kuhn, and you can find some interesting way of explaining science in his works. And basically, epistemic values would mean that you're just doing science to advance the state of knowledge and to understand better the world, while non-epistemic values, it's where you have all other types of values, like the social use, how maybe the science that you're producing could be useful outside of the general idea of advancing knowledge. And I think in climate science in particular, it's clear that because our science, the results from climate science are very important in terms of impact to society, it puts us as climate scientists in this weird position where we've been taught as scientists to do science to improve the state of knowledge, but really we're also aware that there are impacts of climate change, and that the science that we produce is important in how it shapes the future. Well, it doesn't shape the future, but the way it can help to picture different futures depending on the decisions that are taken by decision makers. And what I think is that a number of climate scientists, the ones who are involved in climate services, or who try to think of how the results that we produce in our labs could be useful and how we could help in a way to solve this problem that we're studying, they have very different definitions of what useful means. So what is useful, how the science we produce could be useful, and how it could be used. I think that's questions that we rarely discuss together as climate scientists. And we also don't discuss it enough with non-climate scientists, either decision makers or social scientists. And I think that what I want to show you with the example of extreme event attribution, it is all from perspective from one scientist and others who joined him, that he was building something that could be useful for society. There was this this part of climate science, extreme event attribution, and in particular probabilistic event attribution or risk-based attribution, that was developed. But if you try to look at how useful it could be and try to understand in terms of how it could be implemented, then you see that there are a lot of flaws and maybe it's not as useful as it was thought to be. So we need to go back to the beginnings of extreme event attribution and to the non-epistemic values that are at the core of extreme event attribution. So the first quote is a quote from the Miles Allen commentary, the first paper, where someone, a climate scientist, thought of doing some attribution of extreme events. Politicians have many things to worry about, so perhaps it is time to consider some apolitical mechanisms for redistributing the costs of climate change. I think any scientist who's on the social side of science and who does science of politics would be appalled by reading that any mechanism to redistribute the cost of climate change would be apolitical, whether it comes from science or not. But apparently, it's something that was okay to write in this commentary. And I think it shows very well how we as scientists are educated and how maybe I think a lot of time we lack reflexivity of how science is positioned in a more general state of society, I guess. And then you have this quote from Pardip Palit and co-authors in 2011, our approach could prove a useful tool for evidence-based climate change adaptation policy. So the first idea from Miles Allen is more about providing a tool to help with liability problems and to help citizens to go to court and to sue big firms for emitting emissions and to get some sort of compensation. So we are in this idea of doing something that helps compensating the impacts of climate change. And what Pardip Pal and co-authors say is a bit different, because they're talking about climate change adaptation policy. So adaptation is not about compensation. Compensation is really ex post after the event happened, while adaptation is more about trying to be prepared for the future. And like to confront those two quotes, there's also one early paper by Hume and co-authors published in 2011, where he says, among other critiques of extreme event attribution, as defended by Miles Allen and Oxford and Met Office people, there can be subjectivity in extreme event attribution results, which may simply open up new spaces for political contestation, but not hidden in the language of science. And I think that's already one very important thing to put into regards to the first two quotes, because it all comes from a geographer and someone who's more aware of how climate policy works. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to talk about extreme event attribution and for who and for what it could be useful. And I will explain it using results that I've published in a paper with co-authors in 2020, where we did literature review and some interviews of scientists to understand better why they were doing attribution and for who. And so we divided the answers that we got from those different climate scientists into two big categories. The first one is that extreme event attribution is contributes to knowledge per se, and it may be seen desirable because it may satisfy the curiosity of both scientists and the general public, and it may raise the awareness of policymakers and the general public, which could help to lead to having more climate action. And then extreme event attribution knowledge may be used in an instrumental fashion in order to establish robust causal statements in the context of litigation or adaptation compensation mechanisms. So more on a next post view of what you do after an event happened. That's really the view defended by Miles Allen and others from the same group. And the other way it could be useful is to establish robust probabilistic statements for insurer or for infrastructure designers, engineers, or regulators, more in a vision of helping to foster adaptation to climate change. And you can see that in this lower part of this chart, this is where there's this idea that extreme event attribution could be useful for decision making. So I will go through those different categories. First is maybe the epistemic value. One of the way of looking at extreme event attribution is just to say, okay, it helps to satisfy curiosity. And in terms of scientific interest, from the interviews that we did, there were some diverging views. Everything that's quoted in my presentation where there's no reference, it means that it comes from the interviews that I did. So both from the same pool of scientists I would get, from a scientific perspective, it is maybe not quite as useful. And from a scientific point of view, it's extremely interesting. Most often the scientific interest is seen as a secondary motivation to do extreme event attribution, although it has to be said that extreme event attribution helped to understand better the limits of the models. It's helped to develop many statistical and dynamical tools. So you cannot say that extreme event attribution didn't help in its way to progress in climate science, more that maybe it was twisted way to do some of those progress with this general question of attribution at its core, rather than a question about how extreme events are changing in a changing climate. And other quotes that I thought were interesting is that there was this idea that it was a little bit like ambulance chasing, and that is what paparazzi do. And generally, when a scientist describes the science they do like that. It's not really a way to say that it's very interesting, scientifically speaking. And I think it's interesting because it shows that there are some awkwardness in doing, I hope it's a word, awkwardness, in doing this kind of science. So, but it's not only about satisfying curiosity, because it's also a tool to help raise the awareness of different people. So the idea is that it can help to answer frustration regarding the invisibility of climate change. The whole concept of invisibility of climate change was defined by Rajat Gould in his paper from 2013. That's something that you might want to read because I think it's interesting. But linking the weather, which is something very tangible and that anyone can understand, to climate change, to climate and to climate change, is one of the ways that explain why scientists feel like it's so important to do extreme event attribution, because it helps to say to citizens that they are really already facing the consequences of climate change through extreme weather events. And it's true that there is a clear increase in media coverage, and that a link with climate change is in this media coverage that wasn't done before. Where I'm a bit more cautious is that you have to ask yourself, how does that media coverage compare with other news? Like, I think many climate scientists have many solicitations from the media. It's happening to me more and more too, where you going to get journalists maybe several times a week or several times a day, if you're very well known, that want to have your opinion on the weather and maybe to link them with climate change. But does this coverage really compare to the general media coverage of other topics? And is it something that the viewers of this media coverage are going to remember, or is it just some sort of filler of their news? And that's a question I ask myself a lot when there's a journalist that asks me, oh, I have to do, we need some topic for tonight, and we were thinking about something about this weather event. And it's kind of, yeah, maybe it's not that well thought out. And is it something that anyone is going to remember if it was done this way? Also, there's a question about what exactly is the topic of interest for the media and for the people that could be interested in this type of information. I am under the impression that quantifying the change in probability of occurrence is not their first interest. What concerns them the most is whether there's an anthropogenic contribution or not. I'm not aware of any study that's been trying to see what exactly was interesting for the journalists and what they wanted and what the media wanted to picture, but I have my doubt whether fraction of attributable risk is really what makes the statements that we can do on the influence of climate change interesting or not. But that's, for me, it may be the case, but if it's the case, maybe we should have some study to back that up. And I'm not aware of it existing yet. And another quote from scientists is, people make attribution statements without scientific evidence if we do not provide scientific evidence. I think overall it makes more sense to do so, to do it with the scientific evidence we have. And that's a point that's fair too. So I'm just not trying to say that extreme event attribution is bad in itself. I'm just trying to provide some context where you can see how there are some points that are that make sense and other that don't make so much sense. And there's a personal fear that I have regarding our interactions with the media. I'm not sure that's the right word in English, but there's this culture of media where you get a lot of news all the time. And I think that's called rolling news media. And as soon as there's something happening, you will have an interviewer going there, and it's going to basically flood all the media space with all this information. And that's very different from investigative type of media, where you get generally much better quality of information. And I'm not sure whether extreme event attribution is also a way to follow this trend of media of wanting to have answers right away after the event happened, and where it's just in a flood of information. And I don't think that helps to construct a very interesting discourse around climate change, but that's really personal opinion there. And some important context that I'd like to give you on awareness raising is that without even talking about attribution of extreme events, there are some studies that have been done about the influence of climate extremes. And you can see that they've been done in the US because there's a lack of studies outside of the US. And there's also a lack of studies of the role of attribution statements in the way people react to climate extremes and how they understand and perceive climate change after climate extremes happen. But what's been shown is that the perception of climate change is driven by political orientation, and the influence of climate extremes is not discernible. In one paper, in another paper, there's a modest but discernible effect of extreme events on climate change awareness, but only for recent events, hinting at a short-term phenomenon, like short-term memory of the events. And extreme weather exacerbates political polarization on climate change rather than change the initial initial opinion of the affected people. And I mean, having those results about perception of climate change and the link with extreme weather events shows how it's really tricky to say that you're going to have some awareness raising because of extreme weather events. And I think that if the defenders of extreme event attribution really want to say that it has raised awareness, they need to do some studies to see if it's really the case and if people change their mind because there's been an extreme event where they live and because this extreme event was attributed to climate change. Now, let's go to more the part where there are some ideas that extreme event attribution could help to establish could help decision making either through legal context or through establishing robust probability statements for different types of stakeholders. So for insurers, this comes from Euclid project reports where there was some social science parts of a big project that was done in order to progress on extreme event attribution and to think whether it could be something that could end up being a climate service. So for insurers, there is, and this comes from interviews that have been done of insurers within this project. For insurers, there's a general interest, but there doesn't seem to be added value from extreme event attribution to the existing information. Other components of risk are more important, and it is not applicable in existing business processes. Despite the fact that most of the interviewees were certain that extreme event attribution is relevant, no one was convinced that the added value of extreme event attribution is currently large enough to pay for it. So this is a quote from this report. Insurers don't care at all about the causal explanation. What really matters is the risk and its evolution. And so that's where I feel like wanting extreme event attribution to fit for insurer when rather than starting by getting the questions from insurers and working from that is one of the ways that the idea that science speaks truth to power is a bit twisted in this particular context. Now, if we're talking about adaptation, the general idea is that extreme events could be catalysts for adaptation because extreme events could be seen as harbingers of the future. But, and that there could be some possible cases of misattribution that could lead to poor adaptation decisions. So that's the general idea why it could help for adaptation. So this is a quote from a paper from Travis from 2014. The net effect of extremes on larger policy structures remains ambiguous in the literature, with the hint that even a strong signal does not necessarily ratchet policy adaptation. So here again, there is this idea that from scientists that extreme event attribution are really, extreme events are really the way for people to understand that climate change is happening and that it will lead to adaptation. But if you look at the point of view from social scientists who have been working on disaster management, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Also, extreme event attribution adopts an ex post perspective. So it's always been a bit puzzling to me why we would talk about extreme event attribution helping for adaptation when it's about telling the story of an event that already happened. Other points that were made by Yulm in 2014 were that adaptation should be based on robust decision making. So like decision making that's robust to uncertainties, while extreme event attribution is also very prone to uncertainties. And I've shown you in both the practical and my first lecture on Monday that there can be huge differences in results of extreme event attribution just based on the choice of the methods, of the choice of the definition of the event, or on the choice of the models and data you use. Another point from Hume is that adaptation funding should be based on vulnerability to extreme weather events rather than attributability. And so extreme event attribution, there's an idea behind it of doing some sort of climate justice through helping to compensate for the adverse effects of climate change. But what's really fair? Is it to base your funding on vulnerability or on attributability? I will decide with your own values what's the answer to that question. Then there's also another quote from the UCLIA reports. Most stakeholders found that extreme event attribution would not change their own motivation or way of taking action. They told to be rather in need of information about vulnerability, potential impacts, and promising adaptation options. Such information was not perceived to be enhanced by extreme event attribution results. I will talk later, if I have time, about the difference between extreme events and impacts and how it matters when you start talking about attribution. So here we'll come to the first idea of how extreme event attribution could help for decision making, and try to analyze it a bit more in detail. And that's extreme event attribution for litigation. I will talk about loss and damage and international law rather than general litigation, because I think Lisa Lloyd's had some lecture on values of attribution, and I'm pretty sure that she covered a lot of things related to litigation, although I couldn't attend her lecture. So yeah, and also I don't have time for everything. Yeah, okay, yes, she did, great. So, but you didn't have any history of climate negotiation and explanation of how it works, or did you? Okay, great. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about loss and damage, mostly because I did a specific study on that, and because I think it's also one of the topics that comes back on the table all the time. And I've seen that there have been also new papers where they're a bit worried of the use of extreme event attribution for loss and damage, meaning that it's still on the table. So to understand what loss and damage is and how it's a bit weird, at least for me, who has been to such negotiations and has talked with political science researchers who have worked on COPs for years and years about this problem, I need to explain what's happening in those negotiations and where they come from. So in 1992, there was the Rio Earth Summit and the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And since then, you have been yearly COPs, conference of parties, where the parties, basically a party is close to a country, except that EU counts as a party and it's not really a country. Yeah, you can keep in mind that a party is a country. And so every year you have COPs where the people who are the parties who are part of this framework, they meet and they try to find a way to advance on climate change. And there are three fundamental principles to this convention. So there's a text that you can read if you're interested in this. The precautionary principle, the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principle, and the right of development principle. So after that, the members of the UNFCCC are basically almost everyone in the world, and they are divided into, Annex 1 and 2 parties, which are basically developed or developing countries at the time. So the rich countries in green, the medium-rich countries in blue, and non-annexed parties, which are all the orange ones. And you can see that in those orange ones, there are some countries like China who are not counted as annexed countries, because at the time it was still considered not rich enough. But these divisions still remain in the COPs of today. So after 1992, there's a number of COPs where they meet, and in 1997, they tried to do some international agreement to reduce greenhouse gases emissions, and that's a signature of the Kyoto Protocol, which you might have heard about. It was the first one and very flawed. Then there's a Copenhagen summit, because in between 1997 and 2009, they were realizing that Kyoto Protocol wasn't working too well. Also, the end of the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to be, I don't remember if it's 2012 or 2015, but they needed a new protocol. And the Copenhagen summit was a big failure in reaching a binding climate regime, because they were trying to have some new sort of protocol. But as you can imagine, there were a lot of countries that weren't too keen on having some sort of binding climate law, international law. And then in 2015, there was a Paris Agreement in COP21. I think hopefully you've all heard about it. And it's a universal climate regime for all parties, with provisions for periodic review of nationally determined contributions, called NDCs. And the big difference between this protocol and this one, I see, well, mainly two of them. In this one, the Kyoto Protocol was only binding agreement for the annexed countries and not for the non-annexed countries. And it was legally binding and top to bottom. That's not the right way of saying it, but basically the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up process where everyone comes and says, that's what I'm willing to do. And it's different from trying to have a binding regime where everyone decides that's what we want to do together. We will have to do it. The Paris Agreement doesn't have this kind of binding legal structure. And well, I don't remember where I found this figure, and so don't take those numbers as granted, but it's just to show you that at the time of the Paris Agreement, with the current policies, the uncertainties of what climate change would be at the end of the centuries we could expect plus 3.6 degrees, and with some uncertainties, and with pledges were not enough to go below the 2-degree line. They were just enough to get a bit lower than what the current policies were saying. Of course, it's old and it's been done in 2015. So even the models that like it was CMIP 5, I guess, and not CMIP 6. So it's not the right numbers, but just to show you how it works. There's this general goal of 2 degrees, but which is still very far from it, even with pledges. So how it works. Within COPs, there are discussions about different types of topics. The three big ones are the two big ones are mitigation and adaptation, and loss and damage is kind of their little brother, because mitigation was the core of the COPs and the UNFCCC for a while, where the idea was really to mitigate the emissions and to try to stay below 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. At some point, adaptation became big also, because it was becoming clear that just mitigating wouldn't be enough. And that happened basically after Copenhagen, that adaptation was taking more and more space in the discussions, and that it was accepted that adaptation could be a topic within the COPs, because before there was the idea that talking about adaptation meant that we had failed on mitigation. And then loss and damage is a compensation mechanism that's supposed to be what you do ex post once there are climate disasters. And this started to be in COPs. It's been discussed for a while, but it's been a real topic of this discussion since 2013. Well, there are also discussions on transparency, capacity building, technology transfer, and financing, but I think I'm quite late, so I won't comment on them. So what about attribution of extreme events in climate negotiations? Well, here are two examples. The first one is one I saw in June 2015, so just before COP21, at what's called Intersession. It's smaller discussion that happened between COPs. And those are youth activists, and they are in front of the negotiation rooms, and they are saying to the negotiators, if you still believe 2 degrees is safe, add your name here. And they are holding some papers saying that with pictures of different cyclones and typhoons. And another moment when there's some sort of attribution of extreme events in the context of climate negotiations was back at COP19 in December 2013, when Yep Sanyo was the main negotiator from the Philippines, had this very well-known speech about Ayan. And this is just a small quote from this speech, but I would encourage you to listen to the whole thing. To anyone who continues to deny the reality of that is climate change, I dare you to get off your ivory tower and away from the comfort of your armchair. You may want to pay a visit to the Philippines right now. We must stop calling events like this as natural disasters. It is not natural when science already tells us that global warming will induce more intense storms. So here you have some implicit attribution of those events to climate change. And at the time, and even today, there's a lot of discussion of whether you can really attribute cyclones to climate change, and to link storms and well, anything that's really related to dynamics is harder to do than heat waves. And back then in 2015 or 2013, well, there were even less studies that were able to link the two. So for me, as a climate scientist who was looking at what was happening in negotiations, that was a bit confusing. Now, since 2013, there's something called the Vaso Implementation Mechanism, the WIM. And since 2015, there's an article in the Paris Agreement that's about loss and damage. And it says, parties recognize the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, including extreme weather events and slow onset events, and the role of sustainable development in reducing the risk of loss and damage. And so here we have this idea that it's adverse effects of climate change associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So I think Rachel, James, and co-authors worded quite well. From a scientific perspective, the first challenge in implementing the WIM would be to estimate where and when loss and damage can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change. A body of scientific evidence is growing, which is highly relevant to the WIM, yet it is seen as a distraction from the negotiations. And I think that's very normal to have this reaction as a climate scientist, because, yeah, that's what I would first think about. How do you know they're related to climate change? But if you try to think of it not as a scientist, then you realize that negotiations are not always about the truth of something, but more about, it's not always exactly the scientific truth of something. And the definition of loss and damage itself is very fuzzy. There's no, I think that I didn't put the quote here, but there's a paper where they say that loss and damage is easy because nobody agrees on what it means. But as long as you have this idea of loss and damage, then and everyone sees something different, you can negotiate on it. And that's one of the very different ways of seeing the world between negotiators and scientists. So here you have mapping of the different definition of loss and damage for different people, where you have 4 main ways of seeing it, whereas adaptation and mitigation. Basically, it says that loss and damage are not useful because everything that should be done under the convention is to work on mitigation and adaptation, because the whole goal of the conventions is to avoid loss and damage. This is a vision that's mostly from people from developed countries. Then there's this idea that it's a risk management problem, and it's more an idea from disaster risk reduction experts. That another idea is that loss and damage is what happens when adaptation fails. So it's the limits to adaptation. And then there's an existential view of loss and damage as, well, basically how they put threat to the existence of some people. For example, the people in the small island countries, the seats here. And so you can see that there's a big difference in the definition of what loss and damage are, depending on the type of parties you're talking about, whether they are they are annexed countries, well, the developed countries, or the least developed countries, LDC here. So yeah. Should we use extreme event attribution for loss and damage? Is it a good idea? And there's this controversy between different papers where they see it as good or bad. And there was already a study where they interviewed a panel of 31 stakeholders in 2040, where they found that there was little awareness of extreme event attribution in loss and damage stakeholders and a lack of agreement on its potential use. And what I did was to interview both scientists as a group and loss and damage delegates as another group to see whether it could be extreme event attribution made sense in the context of loss and damage. Of course, to be fair, my hypothesis was that it didn't make a lot of sense, but that came from having this over understanding of negotiations, because I had been already to several COPs and I had some discussions with policy scientists. So yeah. And what I found in this study is that there was a lack of communication between the two groups of interviewees. That's very similar to what was done by Parker et al. And there was a majority of delegates that considered that extreme event attribution could be useful, but for awareness raising and not in an instrumental way. There were 6 hurdles that were that came up from those interviews for practical use of extreme event attribution in negotiations, 2 technical hurdles, the lack of confidence in extreme event attribution results. So basically all the uncertainties that I've shown, like we could discuss about in the practical and the first lecture, the lower attributability of extreme events in the most vulnerable countries. I will explain that in a minute. And then there were 4 political hurdles, the problem of apportionment of responsibilities between emitters. That's something I will come back to also if I have time. And the definition of extreme events, we'll talk about it also a bit more. The apportionment of responsibilities between the ones who failed to mitigate and the ones who failed to adapt. I think that's quite straightforward, but there's a question about who is responsible for the loss and damage. And is it the people who put all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, or the people who adapted poorly to extreme events? And then there's the risk of only dealing with the attributable part of the event. I think it goes back to what Hume was saying about whether what you want to do is to treat extreme event impacts from an attributable point of view or from a vulnerability point of view. So the second hurdle about lower attributability has to do with data injustice. So here you have a map of the GHCN stations, so the Global Historical Climatology Network stations, and you can see that the number of those stations is very different between Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. And And you also have colors showing the number of impacts that have been attributed to climate change in the AR5, the fifth assessment report from the IPCC. And once again, you can see that there's some injustice there. Here you have another map that I found in a paper, very interesting paper from Olson et al., published in 2022, where they show, this is an IPCC map of the locations of substantial drought and heat-induced tree mortality around the globe. You can see that you have a map with forest covers and a lot of red dots in the US, in Europe, and also a bit around Amazonia, but not that much in Africa. And this figure was supposed to be in the summary for policymakers, but African countries refused it, and that's because the problem with the number of dots is that it depends a lot on the number of studies that you have and also the quality of data that you have when you want to talk about something that's a bit more complicated than temperature. And here with the substantial droughts, it's something that's much harder to do with only satellite data than other types of link between impacts and climate change. Then about the apportionment of responsibility between emitters. So this is a figures that was done by Freddy Otto and colleagues in 2018, where they do some extreme event attribution, and they quantify the change in return periods, but they try to assign this change in return period to different countries that emitted some greenhouse gases. And I'm not going to comment on what the different color means. You can look and find it in her paper. But what you see here, that just the way that you count who has emitted what, and that can be, for example, if you count by a number of inhabitants, or if you count by country without taking into account the number of inhabitants in the country, or whether you which date you choose to start to count the emissions and stuff like that. Well, you can have very different answers to who is most responsible for what. And actually, I feel like trying to do extreme event attribution and going to try to do this change in return periods by emitters really shows the limits of extreme event attribution for loss and damage. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip this, but basically the idea here what I wanted to show is that you cannot only talk about extreme events and their impacts just by understanding the role of climate change. You have to understand also the role of other non-climate factors in the impacts happening. And that can be vulnerability or exposition and so on. I think that's one too many slides. But yeah, since I have maybe 10 minutes left, I'd like to talk more about the fact that defining the event is a very tricky question, especially when you want to define the event for compensation. And what happens in the negotiations, what happened when I talked to delegates is that systematically when I was asking them, how would you define the event? They said it was technical and not what they should choose. But on the other side, if you ask scientists how to define the event for this kind of cases, well, it makes sense that you want to discuss how to define this event with the stakeholders. And the way you're going to define it, as we've seen, is going to change the results. And maybe if you really go and try to think of using it for compensation, it's going to change how much you're going to get as compensation. So it's actually very important. So the first point I want to make is that there are different types of events. And of course, there are extreme weather events, but there are also what's called by the UNFCCC slow onset events. And that has more to do with trends. For example, you have sea level rise or ocean acidification, and how we treat those is also a question if we were ready to do some sort of attribution of extreme events impacts to climate change. Then the problem is that you don't want to only attribute the hazard, you want to attribute the impacts. And that means that you have to take into account vulnerability and exposure. And there's a difference between impacts and extreme events. I wanted to show you the results from Karin van der Wiel's paper, where basically she shows how what's an extreme weather event is not necessarily leading to extreme impacts, and how extreme impacts are not necessarily extreme in terms of meteorology, but I don't think I have time for that. Basically, she used a model and showed that, yeah, I will send you the slide. You can look at it a bit more if you want. And then there's also a question of what exactly are the important impacts? And there are, of course, economic losses in loss and damage, but there are also non-economic losses. And here I show you what the UNFCCC counts as non-economic losses. You have losses to individuals, society, and environments. And how can we account for non-economic losses? Is it desirable or not? And there are some stuff that are very hard to model here, like cultural loss of culture, loss of indigenous knowledge, loss of identity, and that's very tricky. And there's a point by Olson et al. About this, where they say that if loss and damage is increasingly pursued through the use of extreme event attribution, there is a very big risk that many, if not most, of the problems associated with climate change will remain unattributed. And I think that's a very fair point. Okay. So if I have 5 minutes left, I'd like to just not talk about only extreme event attribution. I think it's a nice example to see how when you have some sort of climate service that's based on what scientists think is useful, then once you start to translate it in how it could be used, then you're faced with many, many problems of values, and we're very, very far from doing something apolitical. And we are in a case where there are different communities that speak different languages. And for me, the only way forward in climate services is to build them on interdisciplinarity. And that takes time to understand how other disciplines, and especially social science, would see the problem. And I have to say that I used to have a vision of youth activists or Yep Sanyo in COP saying that there's a direct attribution of extreme events to climate change was a problem from my scientific point of view. But then when I started to understand how COPs work and how negotiations work, then I realized that it was of little consequence. Well, maybe not little consequence, but that was not the main point, whether it was really attributable or not of what they were doing. And co-construction with non-academic actors is very key if you want to do some sort of climate service, and not be in this position where you try to fit your own science into a question that was not the question that was asked by those actors. And if you want to do that, that takes time because you need to build trust, you need to understand their problems. And usually, for example, the example that I gave you about how to define an event, that takes time to understand each other and to be able to have constructive dialogue. So yeah, I think I will stop here. I hope that was clear and that gave you some food for thought. There's the definition of climate services, but you can read them yourself. And I hope that you remember that you are not doing your science in a vacuum, and that once you start trying to produce it for stakeholders, and that you start thinking of how it could inform decision making, then you need to, well, if you want to do it well, you need to understand where are the problems of values, where it could impact different groups, and whether you are equipped or not to answer those questions, or whether you need to talk with stakeholders and with social scientists. And yeah, I think that's my main points.
Thanks very much, Aglaé. Do we have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat. I'll just mention that I think Aglaé's touching on a very deep issue that it's much broader than even this one. And for example, there's a lot of philosophers of science that have dealt with this, like Helen Longino in the 90s has some books and and makes the point that a lot of scientists at that time were basically arguing that there was no role for social, influence on the practice of science, and that it should be objective and then an evidence-based, but then they would appeal to social arguments for their science, like social order and stuff like this, and then they would reject any evidence-based analysis of the practice of their science, which is exactly what you're talking about, that if you believe in evidence and logic, you should allow social scientists to apply their evidence and logic to the way that your science is used. So anyway, just it's an interesting example of this broader debate that has come up in general. But I think that climate scientists are not aware of this whole. Well, I think, yeah, a lot of scientists still probably don't really want to accept it, and certainly a lot of climate scientists are resistant to this idea. Yep. We have a comment. Yeah, a question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for this super interesting lecture. And yeah, I have a question because yeah, from attending some previous conversations happening at conferences and workshops, yeah, I've gotten the impression from both people involved in IPCC and social hydrologists, which, yeah, hydrologists trying to incorporate some social science, that there might be an imbalance between scientists or hard scientists slowly waking up to the needs of social science, and so social scientists having, yeah, maybe less having the drive to get involved. And I was wondering, is this true at all in your opinion, or and if so, how can we try to involve more social scientists?
Yeah, I'm not saying that the people who do attribution don't try to involve social scientists. They do, and the Oxford people, they work with stakeholders and social scientists. It's just like, for example, in the EU CLIA project, a lot of the results, they were quite negative towards extreme event attribution, but it didn't change anything. It was more like, okay, the social scientists said something, we don't really want that result, so we will ask other social scientists next time. I guess that's a bit of the way that, maybe I shouldn't say that in the recorded room, but yeah. About your question, I think you have to remember that there are way less social scientists than natural and physical scientists, and that it's also not their role to just answer all questions. That's where it's tricky. And that's where you also need to take time to, once again, not give your question that's a question that's been done by climate scientists or by hydrologists or natural scientists, and not try to understand what they think is the relevant question. And for me, it takes time. It's very frustrating that it takes time, but you need to build the trust. And for me, building the trust with the social scientists that I work with is a several year thing. And that's the same with stakeholders. And that it's also a problem that we're in science, we have this rapid science culture where we need to publish all the time. But if you want to do a meaningful project with social scientists and with stakeholders, it takes many years to do that. So yeah, that would be my answer. I'm not sure it's very satisfying, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's very challenging.
Yeah.
Elena has a question too.
Yeah, I see. Do you think that too technical language is a big issue? Yes, maybe it depends for who. Because like for insurers, you rarely go too technical. but for general public, you often go to technical. So, and for me, there's like, if you really are interested in extreme event attribution and how to make it more understandable, then you would need to do some sort of projects with cognitive scientists and try to test hypotheses on a group of people on how they would react to different ways to explain how an event is connected to climate change. The problem is whether that's the one thing that the cognitive scientists want to work on or not, whether you're going to find funding for it or not. And yeah, that's how I would try to do it.
Loritz has a question.
Do you think the focus extreme events in part stems from thresholds being hard to get media focus? I don't know actually if thresholds are talked about less than extreme events, like the 1.5 degree, or I think like in media, the last, at least from in France, from my point of view, the big climate discourse of the last few months was that we have 3 years left, which was not at all what the climate scientists from the IPCC wanted to communicate, but that's what happened. There was even an activist in Roland Garros who tied herself to the net with the number of days left, which like is a way to communicate this problem of 3 years that the climate scientists have said is really not the way that they want to communicate. So yeah, I don't know if I would say, I'm not sure. And also there are a lot of misconception of what the science knows and what the science doesn't know. And for example, the negotiators that I interviewed, they thought that extreme events was much better. It was easier to attribute extreme events to climate change, and that the science was well done and already there. And in comparisons to slow onset events such as sea level rise and ocean acidification, for which you have detection and attribution studies. So I don't know. Sorry, maybe that's not the answer to your questions, but that's what it inspires me.
Yeah. I just said I agree, like from what I'm seeing too. Okay, I think we're at the end. Thank you very much, Aglaé. So we're going to have an experiment. The Barcelona group is doing, I guess, what in English we call a flipped classroom environment, where we're going to start with the practical session and then have the theory afterwards. So we'll see how that works. Thanks again to both of you, Marlene and Aglaé. And actually, there is a link between causality and social influence on science, but not time to get into that here. But it's a very interesting parallel. All right, see you guys later.
Bye.